Thank you very much for this kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here. Unfortunately, I'm here under false premises for at least three reasons I can think of. First of all, I'm about to fall asleep since I got up at 11:45 last evening to catch a plane to come out here, so I hope I don't put myself to sleep here. Secondly, I really don't know very much about U.S.-China relations and don't have a great deal to say about that, but I will try and touch base. And thirdly, I'm an economist and I study China, and I've been doing it for a long time. The difficulty is that Asia has really given economists a rough ride in the 20th century. When I was a graduate student, one of my instructors said that if you look at 19th century writings about the forecasts for the 20th century U.S. economy, it's not the economists you look at for any inkling of what's going to happen. You look at science fiction. But I'm afraid that when it comes to Asia in the 20th century, even science fiction is not enough to help us understand what's happened, first with Japan, then with Taiwan and Korea and Hong Kong and Singapore, and last but not least with the People's Republic of China. When I started studying China and Asia, most Chinese didn't have enough to eat. Now the problem is too much to eat, obesity, diet foods, exercise clubs, and so on. I mean, the changes are just astonishing. In fact, the growth spurt, the boom that China has developed since the late 1970s that continues as we speak this evening is a major event in world economic history. Deserves to be considered in that light. Of course, there are many problems in measuring the scope of Chinese economic achievements. The Chinese government has an unfortunate habit of inventing data to cover up downturns in China's economy. Most recently, at the end of 2008 and into 2009, when the Chinese economy was hit very hard by the financial crisis and the ensuing global recession, the Chinese government announced that the economy had grown by 6% in real terms in the fourth quarter of 2008, which is a complete fantasy. In fact, the economy declined and declined substantially and continued declining at least through the first quarter of 2009 and quite possibly into the second and perhaps even the third quarter. So essentially, China experienced a recession, but it recovered very rapidly thanks to a rapid and effective application of fiscal and monetary stimulus, which reflects another important point here, which is the very rapidly increasing knowledge, insight, and competence on the part of Chinese economists and Chinese officials. So what we see here is not only that, but also the centrality of economics in the political system of the People's Republic of China. I will say this for the third time on this campus today. I will give you my naive view of the Chinese political system, and Professor Pei can correct me momentarily. Hear from his much more sophisticated perspective. It's really very simple. I see a grand bargain between the Chinese leadership and the Chinese people, in which the leadership requires the people to listen respectfully to the political claptrap that comes out on formal occasions about the three represents and the sanjiang. What do you call that? The three yakety yak? I don't know. And if people don't pay respect to these things, they become human rights statistics. But there are also obligations that the regime undertakes, and there are two obligations. They're obliged to deliver prosperity, and they're obliged to deliver China's standing in the world community. And they've delivered the goods, much to the satisfaction of people in China on both counts. But when you get this sudden downturn in the Chinese economy that comes at China from outside, the regime must respond very quickly and with great energy, because they're standing on two pillars, and one of them all of a sudden is wobbling. So the Chinese really distinguished themselves by achieving a very rapid V-shaped recovery from this recession. We talked about a V-shaped recovery, and so far have been unable to achieve anything of the sort. So what we see in China is we see that a deeply flawed political economy system can deliver enormous economic benefits despite inefficiencies and despite all the shortcomings that you're all familiar with: corruption, unemployment, inequality, environmental problems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Is this system efficient? No, it isn't. But economic growth is typically not an efficient process. It's typically a very messy process, and that's true in the United States as well as Asia. If we want to talk about circumstances that can bring Chinese growth to a halt, we can't just make a list of flaws. That's not enough, because powerful economic systems. Here I'm thinking of Rostow's idea of the takeoff into sustained growth. When I was a graduate student, this book came out, Rostow's book, The Economics of Takeoff into Sustained Growth. And we were all taught to debunk Rostow, that he said investment rises from 5% to 10%. Well, it doesn't. He says there has to be a leading industry. Well, often there isn't, and so on. So the Rostow was wrong about all the details. But this idea that economies either have momentum or they don't. Look at Japan. Decades of momentum and now decades of no momentum. Look at China. Decades of very little momentum and now decades of... This idea will not go away. It's like these toys where you knock them down and they bounce back. Bounce back. So China very much reminds me of Rostow's idea. So if we want to inquire what could stall Chinese economic growth, you have to look in the engine room. You can't just look around the periphery. And to my mind, the big issue that threatens to hobble Chinese economic growth, and has done so for a long time without actually hobbling, is the investment system. Financing, the planning, the implementation of investment projects is very weak, very problematic, imposes huge costs on the Chinese economy. There are monstrous seasonal fluctuations. There are huge financial risks, and we're going to see another peak in financial risks as the loans that were thrown at qualified borrowers, I mean politically qualified, not economically qualified borrowers, in 2009 as part of the anti-recession program come due and aren't paid. Their very low rate of return on investment. People have suggested that India's economy grows about as fast as China's in the last 10 years, especially if you take out the episodes of inflated growth for China in 2008, 2009, and also in the late 1990s and 2003 with the SARS scare. So India is growing about as fast as China with 20 percentage points less of GDP invested. And India is not efficient, not by a long shot. And China is worse in this regard. And the fourth fallout from this investment problem is low growth of employment in China, which is really surprising since everybody in China takes employment issues very seriously. And yet we have a significant slowdown of employment growth starting in the mid-1990s and no sign of any change. And the underlying reason for this is that the political economy militates against employment growth by pushing up labor costs, pushing down capital costs, and channeling capital into the hands of agents, mainly state enterprises, that spend a lot of money but don't create jobs. The amount of capital per worker in the state sector is something like 3 times the amount in the private sector, and despite the private sector's overwhelming contribution to employment creation in China in the past 15 years, the institutional circumstances surrounding private business activity improve at a glacially slow rate. And this is a big this is the big shortcoming, from my perspective, in China's very dynamic economy. The reason I think that China's rapid growth can go on for some time, not at the rates we've seen recently, leaving aside the period of the crash and recession, but at substantial rates. I think the underlying factor propelling Chinese economic growth is the human resources in the People's Republic. And I trace this back, I fear, I don't want to be hooked here, so I fear we can't talk about this at length, but this is a historical subject. It goes back decades and centuries before the creation of the People's Republic, and to this historical legacy, we must add the result of the PRC efforts to expand education. We must add the impact of foreign investment, and now the impact of Chinese outbound foreign investment, which is often intended to create new streams of knowledge coming back home to contribute to productivity growth, the rapid increase of R&D spending in China, much of it by Chinese entities, but also by foreign firms located in China. And I see, as a result of this, I see many opportunities for raising productivity going forward in China. And again, let me skip details in the interests of avoiding being thrown back into my chair forcibly here. So I should say that I see the Chinese economy as facing good prospects. I think China's economy can grow for 10 years, for 15 years, for 20 years at rates in the neighborhood of 6 to 8% per year without much difficulty. I don't expect growth to be smooth, so I think disruptions of the sort that we've seen in 2008, 2009 are to be expected. This past time it was from external sources, but there could be hiccups from internal sources as well. And I should say that underlying my favorable prognostications here are two assumptions that I'm not going to talk about. The first is I'm assuming domestic political stability, and Professor Pei will have something to say about that. And second, I'm assuming that China continues to have access to global markets, which is increasingly important for the dynamics of the Chinese economy. Public discussion focuses on China's exports, but I think from the Chinese perspective, people will be increasingly appreciative of the contribution of imports to Chinese economic growth, because China is short of almost every kind of raw material with the sole exception of coal, and I guess we should now add rare earth to the mix. So in the interests of contributing to the topic up for discussion here tonight, let me make two further comments. One, on the subject of international relations, which is not my field of specialization. I mean, what we see here is a giant country stepping forward on the world stage, gaining strength year by year in every dimension of human endeavor, in economics, in business, in technology, in military affairs, in research, everywhere. And this is uncomfortable for the incumbents on the world stage, because they have to readjust and get out of the way and reorganize to make room for the new entrant. And of course, we've seen this before many times in world history, and we know that the outcome can be smooth, as when the United States replaced Britain as the leading global power, or when Japan moved into a major position in global economic life in the second half of the 20th century, or it can be violent and disruptive. I invite you to think about the entry of Germany and Japan onto the global stage in the century preceding 1945. And the big question here, which really overshadows the question of U.S.-China relations, is how is this going to play out? How are China's partners and neighbors, trade partners, diplomatic partners, and potential rivals going to adjust, and how will China adjust to this new situation in which China becomes more and more prominent and develops greater and greater capabilities year by year. So from this perspective, it seems to me we can see the Chinese feeling their way in this new environment. Sometimes they work in cooperative directions. Sometimes they behave in a very truculent fashion, as we see in recent weeks when some piddling territorial dispute with Japan leads the Chinese to a short-sighted, very foolish suspension of exports of an important raw material to Japan. They're going to regret this. They're already backtracking, saying, "Oh, we're not going to use rare earths as a political weapon." Well, too bad. They already did it, and people will not forget. The Japanese are already arranging to produce rare earths in Vietnam within a matter of weeks. So our position here is a position of trying to interact with our Chinese friends, partners, and sometimes rivals, and to try and create some sort of constructive approach to this very difficult situation, which is bound to be filled with friction, even under the most favorable circumstances. And our third speaker will have plenty to say about that because he works in the middle of this. I would just like to mention, it occurred to me on the airplane that Kozo Yamamura, a retired professor at the University of Washington, wrote what I thought at the time was a very important paper about Japanese adjustment about 20 years ago called Shedding the Shackles of Success. And the idea was that once Japan had arrived, they should ease up burdens on their population that they imposed in order to help lift the economy. I think these ideas need to be dusted off and examined very carefully in the perspective of China, and I intend to go home and look this over. I suggest that you do as well. And the final point that I'd like to make is about our own economy. I think in our efforts to steer China in constructive directions so that this whole process can play out smoothly rather than violently, I think it's very important for us to maintain our own economic strength. And it's my personal belief that since the bottom of the crisis, once we stop the crash, for which both the Bush and the Obama administrations share credit, I think since then our economic policy has been very poor. Some of it shockingly poor, in my opinion. And I think it's time to stop telling other people to adjust and start planning for our own adjustment. And I think that this is an area in which blame can be spread liberally across the entire political spectrum. I'll be glad to say more about any of these things and lots else beside if you're interested. But for the moment, thank you very much, and let's hear from our other speakers.